Okay, hello everybody. My name is Hilliard. I'm the CTO of INEX, and I want to talk to you about resiliency in a pandemic, or how to prepare an internet exchange for a global emergency. There's a couple of key headings that I want to go through here. How to spot warning signs, what to do, what sort of engineering works need to be done, how to handle your internal processes, and once that's all done, where do you go? So just as a recap and in terms of timelines, this all started off in China, as everybody knows, when there was a national epidemic centered in Wuhan in Hubei province. This actually coincided with the Chinese New Year, and this was fortunate and unfortunate for a lot of reasons. It meant that everybody in China was away from their homes, and it presented an ideal environment for the virus to spread. But from the point of view of the external viewpoint, what we saw was that at the beginning of the Chinese New Year, all Chinese production stopped. This is normal for China. There are 2 times every year that Chinese production stops, and Chinese New Year is one of them. And at the end of that, at the end of the New Year celebrations, it became clear that maybe Chinese manufacturing production was not going to restart. And at around the same time, at the end of January, I think on January the 30th, the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared a global emergency. This wasn't because the coronavirus had spread terribly far outside China at that stage, but it was a fairly clear signal for everybody in the world to start paying attention to what was potentially going to become quite a serious problem. We were keeping a fairly close eye on this, and we figured that it was going to be fairly important to start preparing things. So we started looking at this in earnest around the beginning of February. The first stage was internal preparation. After that, we had a bunch of core engineering works, which were quite visible, and the membership saw an awful lot of that. By about the beginning of March, our preparation was largely complete. Okay, so in terms of warning symptoms then, China was not exactly unfamiliar with the idea of epidemics. They had a SARS outbreak in 2002, and that led to early media reports around the end of December, and there was a lot of epidemiological concern expressed in a lot of countries about how the virus was spreading uncontrolled in China. The first major issue that we saw was that 1 meter low smoke zero halogen patch cables were no longer available at our favorite supplier. And these are just commodity items. This is what is used for pretty much every single patch cable in the world. You can still get other types of patch cables, PVC patch cables, but the low smoke zero halogen are the type that we prefer, and they were no longer available. So in terms of risk assessment, how do you approach this? And there were 2 issues that we identified fairly early on. The first issue was a very short-term issue of, well, if you have a pandemic, and if Ireland was going to be subject to the same restrictions that we saw being rolled out in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, how are we going to handle disaster recovery situations? Were there going to be travel restrictions in place? Were there going to be data center lockdowns in place? We didn't have answers to these questions, and we certainly didn't know whether we were actually going to even be able to deal with them if they cropped up. From the longer term point of view, we immediately identified that there were going to be supply chain issues. And there were 2 components to this. The first thing were the sort of supply chain problems that were going to lead to problems with like patch cables, cable management units, all of that sort of thing. And then from a longer term point of view, we were concerned about what would happen with fixed assets. So for example, switches, WDM components here. And the issue that we were concerned about was that these are very complex components. I mean, if you have a patch cable shortage, you literally have, tens of items going into a patch cable assembly. But if you have, say, a wave division multiplexing chassis, if you had a supply chain problem with, say, a screw manufacturer way, way, way down the supply chain, then the final assembly, you couldn't actually complete it because you didn't have the necessary screws to literally screw it all together. So from that point of view, supply chains are actually very delicate things, and if you mess around with them too much, you can end up with all sorts of unexpected supply problems. Even with the simpler units, even if you had, say, for example, a plastics component shut down in Bangkok or Malaysia or wherever they make plastic beads, that can have knock-on effects way down the supply chain. We also were keeping a pretty close eye on what was happening in other countries, specifically Hong Kong and Italy. And the early warning symptoms that we saw at the Hong Kong Internet Exchange and the Milan Internet Exchange were that when you had a lockdown, a civil lockdown in place, everybody stayed at home, and internet exchange traffic jumped by a fairly substantial amount. Now, we identified this as a problem because some member ports at INEX were full. We didn't really we had some visibility into this, but not enough sort of IXP manager visibility. So we could kind of manually go through each port and look at it and see what the story was, but we didn't have a control panel to see what the story was. Okay, we'll get on to that a little bit more. In terms of processes, this is a fairly important component of dealing with business continuity. And the two issues that the two primary issues that we identified here were supplier liaison and office management. So supplier liaison is, how do you deal with the suppliers that you have that are actually critical to your business being able to operate? Data centers are obviously a fairly serious and important part of this. But we also decided that we were going to have to order a whole pile of components in advance and a whole pile of fixed assets in advance. You can trivialize this by saying that this is toilet paper handling. I don't really think so, because last year, for example, for fixed assets for our WDM supplies, we saw lead times for various reasons increase from 4 to 5 weeks in 2018 to 4 to 5 months in 2019 when we were ordering the same types of components. Who knows what would happen when there were supply chain problems. In terms of office management, we already have a pretty lax approach to working from home. Essentially, anybody in INEX technical operations can just get up of a morning and sort of say, look, I'm just going to work from home today. As long as there's nothing critical in the office, we just like send a message on IRC, and that's absolutely fine. There's no issue with that. So we were already pretty happy about our working from home arrangements. Cold spares in the stores. Now, our cold spare stock is handled out in City West, but we didn't know whether we were going to be able to gain access to the data center in City West, or at least to the INEX office in the data center in City West, to be able to get access to spares in case we had a problem. And at this stage, we were beginning to see things like Equinix clamping down on access. And of course, if you clamp down on access to a data center, how do you get access to a data center to get your cold spares to take them out to bring them to another data center? Well, these are important issues. In terms of engineering works, So there were a couple of things that we needed to do here. The first was to look at how to make IXP Manager better, so that we can get better visibility into who's running their ports hot. Now, ports running hot at an internet exchange is a pretty normal thing. Lots of people run their ports hot, that's fine. But if there is a situation where people can actually no longer get access due to civil limitations or data center limitations to upgrade their ports, or even due to component shortages, this created a requirement for us to actually contact all of the people, all of the member organizations who are running their ports hot, to talk to them about, what their plans were in this area, because we could no longer guarantee in the civil lockdown situation that we'd be able to handle this. So I'd like to give a call out to Jan and to Barry about the writing quite a lot of code in an awful lot of a hurry, which was released as IXP Manager 5.4.0 to introduce a new control panel on the admin side, so we could actually see who was running their ports hot and what we could do to make upgrades an awful lot easier. Because the one thing we didn't want to do is to have all of the members deciding at some stage in the future, oh my goodness, we need to upgrade. But then we would have to say to them, well, look, we can't necessarily handle this on a fixed timeline. So there are two aspects to this. First of all, three aspects actually. First of all, IXP Manager. Secondly, upgrading the INEX network core to be able to handle any potential future upgrades. And thirdly, pre-building an awful lot of spare capacity in the data center, so that if a member decided that they needed an upgrade in short order, we could do it purely on a remote hands basis. This flushed out quite a bit of upgrades on the network, and we think we went from about 3.3 terabits of connected edge capacity to about 4.3 terabits of connected edge capacity. So that's about a 30% growth in edge capacity over a period of 2 to 3 weeks, which is pretty substantial. So looking at how this worked on the INEX network core, this is what the INEX network core looked like in December. And you can see up here that the major choke point for traffic was the Kilcarby Park to City West link. That link was running at about 30% capacity. We did a bit of link rebalancing at the time, but we also shifted our traffic parameters so that at this stage, our network is now looking quite a bit different. The bulk of our traffic is actually flowing between Interaction and City West, rather than from Kilcarby to City West. So in terms of the preparations that we did, the first was to build out additional WDM resiliency in Northwest Business Park. This was something that had been on the cards for a long time, but was actually delayed because we needed to do an awful lot of cabinet reorganization. And of course, cabinet reorganization is the ultimate in tedium. We're essentially taking something that works quite well, reorganizing it, hoping that there's minimal disruption, and then at the end of it all, you're left with something that is going to work quite well. So the net gain from an external point of view is pretty limited, so that's why it had been put on the back burner. We had to expedite that by quite a large degree. In order to be able to get free up enough space in the cabinet to put all of the WDM kit in the right positions in the cabinet, move it around, and then install additional WDM capacity and another WDM chassis in the cabinet in order to give full resiliency for that. The astute people will notice that we finished up that maintenance window at I think about 1 or 2 minutes before the maintenance window was due to shut. The reason for that was that we'd actually finished 20 minutes earlier, and we were closing up the cabinet door, and then due to a bar going across the front of the cabinet door, we realized that the door would no longer shut. And this happened at 20 minutes before the maintenance window was due to shut. So anyway, these things happen. That's the joys of late night maintenance. We did get it completed, but it was a bit of a panic at the end. But everything was fine. In terms of the rest of the network, we added a new 100 gig switch in CityWest, and this has now put CityWest into the long-term 100 gig configuration. So the two switches on the left-hand side, CityWest 1.1 and CityWest 1.2, those are Arista 7280s. Those are now edge switches with 100 gig uplinks and 10 gig downlinks to member boards. The switches on the right-hand side are pure 100 gig, 32 port 100 gig Tomahawk switches. That's an architecture feature that will roll out to Kilcarby Park and to Park West as well. And that obviously involved a restructuring of how the network connectivity for those switches was going to be handled. So they're dual homed into the Tomahawk boxes. And after that, it was a matter of adding capacity, and we added capacity on 3 data center cores and 2 Metrolinks. We didn't have capacity on the Kilcarby Park to CityWest link for a couple of reasons. First of all, because we didn't actually have enough cold spare capacity to be able to do the upgrade. But also because it wasn't strictly necessary. The hot links on this network were Park West on the bottom right-hand side of the network diagram, over to BT CityWest on the bottom left-hand side, and then up to the top left-hand side in Equinix DB1 in CityWest. And we figured if we could get the hot links built out, we could deal with the cooler links at a later stage. The cooler links are going to depend on getting the new switches in, and that order went in a couple of weeks ago. So we're going to have to see how that's what the delivery times are there. So that pretty much completed the architectural changes. And then going back to the timeline, those preparations were pretty much completed by the end of March in terms of core engineering, internal preparation, risk analysis. That just left member upgrades, which were more or less completed by mid-April. Sorry, by mid-March. And finally, we entered into a period of civil lockdown at the tail end of March. It's now clear that the civil lockdown isn't a complete civil lockdown, which is very reassuring, because that means that our work travel situation is now completely stable. We can get from A to B if we need to, and there simply won't be an issue with this. There's no change to INEX operational output. We can maintain this position indefinitely. Obviously, it's working from home. It's a slightly different proposition working from home in this sort of situation, because previously it would be nice and quiet, whereas I think everybody now understands we have family milling around and people bursting in the door and phone calls going off. But we can still run our network operations fully remotely. Data center access, we're happy that we will maintain access to all data centers in future. We don't anticipate that there are going to be any problems with this. We have some fixed asset items on order. Switches are on order already, and we're just about to put in some orders for WDM components. And our component store is actually in pretty good shape at this stage. We have all of the patch leads we need. We have all of the transceivers we need. Interestingly, we didn't go to our usual supplier for low smoke, zero halogen 1 meter patch leads. We went to a different supplier, paid a little bit more than we usually do, but our usual supplier still does not have low smoke, zero halogen patch leads, which tells us that they are still having very significant manufacturing or supply chain capacity problems internally, and we see that there's going to be no change to this in the immediate future. So our predictions on supply chain issues were correct in retrospect, and that's something that we were pleased to be able to rectify at a fairly early stage. So overall, we're in pretty good shape, and we're happy about how things are going to proceed over the next while. So that just about wraps it up, and thank you all very much for listening.